It's funny, isn't it? You spend your whole life trying to figure out who you are, where you fit in, like, what's my purpose? Where do I belong? And the more you chase after it, the more it feels like it's just, I don't know, just out of reach.
It's like a paradox, right?
Go back.
This deep need to know who we are, but then, like, what even is identity? It's always changing, right?
Totally. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're diving into Dr. Timothy Keller's lecture, Identity. He's this super insightful theologian, pastor, and get this, really funny.
Oh, yeah, he's great at that.
He's got this way of taking these really complex ideas, making you laugh, but also making you rethink, everything.
Yeah, he starts off by talking about these two different approaches to identity. He calls them traditional and modern.
Okay, so break those down for me. I feel like we've all experienced both of these at some point, haven't we?
Absolutely. So he describes traditional identity as this outside-in kind of thing. Imagine one of those old family photos where everyone's dressed up, perfectly posed. Your spot in that photo, your role, your worth, it's all pretty much decided by your family, your community, maybe your religion.
Right.
You're trying to live up to those expectations, and in doing that, you belong.
So it's like you know your place and you stick to the script, basically.
Exactly. Then you fast forward to today and everything's flipped. Now it's all about inside-out identity. Now you're supposed to look inside yourself, find your authentic self, your truth, and then demand the world accepts you for it.
That let it go moment from Starzan, right? Also saying, this is me, deal with it.
Exactly. Dr. Keller even uses that example. He says it's a perfect example of how we've shifted to this idea of defining ourselves and expecting everyone to be okay with it.
Okay, so we've got outside in versus inside in. When you were describing the traditional one, I felt a little, I don't know, conflicted. Having those set roles and expectations could be comforting, but also kind of limiting, like being forced into a box that doesn't quite fit.
And Dr. Keller acknowledges that even though tradition emphasizes community and belonging, it can be stifling.
Yeah.
Especially if you don't fit the mold. And that's where the appeal of this modern identity comes in.
For sure, because creating your own path, being true to yourself, that sounds amazing. But then again, isn't that a whole other set of challenges, figuring out who you are when the world's constantly telling you who you should be? That's a lot of pressure.
And that's exactly where Dr. Keller starts pointing out the problems with this modern idea of identity.
So modern identity, it's all about discovering yourself, finding your truth, being authentic. Sounds pretty good, right?
It does, doesn't it? But this is where Dr. Keller throws a bit of a wrench in the works. He points out some pretty big problems with this whole be yourself idea.
Problems? Like, what could be wrong with that?
Well, he says that even though modern identity is supposed to be all about freedom and authenticity, it can actually be super restrictive, even contradictory. He uses 4 words to describe it: incoherent, fragile, socially fragmenting, and an illusion.
Okay, incoherent is a strong word. What does that even mean in this context?
He's saying that our inner desires, those deep down feelings we think are the most true to ourselves, they're not always clear or consistent.
Right, like one day you want to be surrounded by people, the next day you need your space. Or you dream of being an artist, but also you need to pay rent.
Exactly. Our desires often clash. It's like, how can we build a solid identity when the foundation is constantly shifting?
And then we go on social media, and everyone seems to have these perfect lives, traveling, starting businesses, raising perfect kids, and you're stuck in traffic feeling like you're failing at life.
Exactly. Our inner world can be a mess of contradictions. So how can we build a stable identity on that?
It's a good question. So if we can't even rely on our own desires, where do we even start?
That takes us to Dr. Keller's next point, this idea that modern identity is actually really fragile. He says that even though it emphasizes self-validation, it often makes us more dependent on what other people think.
Oh, 100%. We post a selfie and then obsess over the likes and comments. Deep down, we still crave that external validation.
Totally. We're told to love ourselves, embrace our uniqueness, but then we immediately turn around and measure our worth by how many likes we get. It's like this endless cycle of needing other people to tell us we're okay, even though we're supposed to already know that ourselves.
It reminds me of that quote Dr. Keller shared from Freddie DeBoer. He said, I see people who are the most outwardly successful and confident, popular, winning awards, doing well in their careers, and yet deep down, they hate themselves.
It's so true, right? We put on this show of having it all figured out, but inside we're struggling with insecurity. It's like this pressure to be perfect, to be happy, to love ourselves all the time. It's exhausting.
And it's not just a few people, it's like a whole generation. Think about the rates of anxiety, depression, perfectionism in young people today. There was a study that showed that millennials are like drowning in perfectionism and workaholism. It's like this constant pressure to achieve, to prove their worth, to create this perfect image online.
And that ties right into Dr. Keller's third point about social fragmentation. If we're all so focused on our own self-improvement, on getting what we want, where does that leave our relationships with others?
It becomes all about me, right? Like, if it's not benefiting me directly, why should I even bother?
Exactly. And Dr. Keller argues that this focus on individual fulfillment leads to a decline in commitment to relationships, communities, even just being a good citizen. It's like we're all becoming more isolated and disconnected.
So we're stuck with this internal compass that's spinning out of control. We're looking to other people to tell us who we are, and we're only focused on ourselves. That doesn't sound like a recipe for a happy life. So basically what we're hearing is that both the traditional and the modern ways of looking at identity, they kind of have some holes, right? It's like we're trying to build a house on sand here. So where we go from here? Is there like a better way to think about identity, a way to actually find solid ground?
That's the big question, right? And here's where Dr. Keller brings in what might seem, I don't know, kind of radical, especially these days. The Christian perspective on identity, and it all comes down to this idea of grace.
Okay, I'll be honest. When I hear grace, I think cheesy inspirational posters with like sunsets and rainbows. But knowing Dr. Keller, there's got to be more to it than that. So how does grace fit into this whole identity thing?
Well, that's the thing. See, in the Christian view, your identity isn't something you have to achieve or earn or even discover on some journey of self-exploration. It's not about following a set of rules perfectly or creating this perfect image for everyone else. It's about receiving. It's a gift. It's rooted in this idea of God's unconditional love for you.
So it's not about what you do. It's not about how well you know yourself. It's about how you're known by something bigger than yourself.
Exactly. And that something, in this case, is God. Dr. Keller really stresses that this love, this acceptance from God, it's not based on your performance or your accomplishments or anything you do. It's rooted in something way bigger, way more solid. He quotes a passage from the Bible. It says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us so that in him we might become the righteousness of God.
Whoa. Okay, we went from Elsa to the Bible pretty fast. Become the righteousness of God. That's a lot to unpack. What does that even look like in real life?
Yeah, it's one of those phrases that can be confusing, but it's actually super freeing when you get it. Imagine feeling like you're completely known, seen for who you really are, deep down, and yet totally loved and accepted, not because of what you do, but just because you are. That's kind of the heart of righteousness here. It's not about being perfect. It's about being in a right relationship with God through Christ, no matter your flaws or your failures.
That changes everything. You're not constantly trying to earn love or acceptance. You're free to just live knowing you're already loved. But doesn't that lead to laziness? If you know you're accepted no matter what, why even try to grow or become a better person?
It's a question people ask all the time. And Dr. Keller always points out that grace, like real grace, it doesn't make you lazy. It actually creates a whole different kind of motivation. It's not about being afraid of judgment or desperately needing to prove yourself. It becomes about love. You're motivated by this incredible, undeserved gift of acceptance, and that makes you want to live a life that reflects that love.
So it's like instead of being driven by insecurity or needing to please people, you're becoming the best version of yourself because of love and thankfulness.
Exactly. And here's the amazing part. When your identity is rooted in this solid foundation of grace, you can approach other people differently too. You're not threatened by their differences. You're not competing for attention. You can celebrate their successes without feeling insecure, offer grace when they mess up, and just appreciate the diversity of people without comparing yourself or feeling threatened. Like Dr. Keller tells the story about visiting a church in South Africa, and he met this woman there, and he was like, this woman is my spiritual superior, even though she was living in poverty. And he was this successful pastor in New York City.
Wow, that's such a powerful example of how this kind of identity, this grace-based identity, it leads to humility and openness. It's not about putting yourself down. It's about realizing your worth doesn't come from what you do or your social status. It's about seeing the value in every single person, no matter what.
And that's the beautiful thing about this Christian view of identity. It's not about fitting in, whether it's to some old tradition or some image you've created in your head. It's about embracing who you are, imperfections and all, because you're loved. It's about finding freedom from this constant pressure to be perfect and discovering a way more fulfilling way to live in the world.
We covered so much in this deep dive, from why we're so obsessed with finding ourselves to the problems with how we try to do it, and then this whole other way of seeing it all through this idea of Christianity and grace. It's definitely a lot to think about.
It is. And it's a conversation worth having over and over again. Because let's face it, we all need a firm foundation, something steady and reliable when it comes to figuring out who we are and where we fit in this crazy world.
That's for sure. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something to chew on. What if real freedom and lasting joy, what if those things come from finding our identity in something bigger than ourselves, something constant, something that's always there, something that never runs out? What would it look like for you to start looking for that deeper sense of purpose and worth starting today? What if you're not just a bunch of achievements or insecurities, but something much more, something more true, something loved